So you finally decided to put on your big boy pants and start learning how to 3D model. Now you may be asking yourself, what are the things that I should keep in mind when I 3D model? Well, seek no further, little wolf. I am here to tell you everything there is to know about 3D model. Now starting with a mesh, you might be asking yourself, what is a mesh? A mesh is basically a fancy smanchy word for a 3D model. Each mesh is made up of 3 components: the vertices, edges, and faces. Your job as a 3D modeler is to get a primitive shape and move its vertices, edges, and faces around to create a masterpiece. Now of course it's not as simple as literally just moving around the vertices, edges, and faces. There are lots of tips and tricks you can learn to turn these primitive shapes into more complex shapes. If you want to learn how to do that, you should watch my other video talking about the basics of Blender. Now moving on to topology. So topology is basically the edges and vertices that make up faces that make up a 3D model. So they're literally the backbone of 3D modeling. Now you might be asking, my model looks good, why do I have to care about good topology? Shut the fuck up. But anyways, meshes with bad topology can cause a lot of issues. For example, they can make UV unwrapping a pain in the ass. They can also be super unoptimized. They will most definitely cause shading issues. And if you plan to animate your model, it could also deform weirdly. Now the most common example of bad topology is n-gons. An n-gon is basically when you have a face that has more than 4 sides. Generally when you're 3D modeling, you want your faces to have either 3 sides, which is also known as a tri, or 4 sides, which is known as a quad. Now there are certain circumstances when you can have n-gon, but for the most part as a beginner you should aim to have good topology with little to no n-gons. As I mentioned before, having good topology is extremely crucial if you want to deform your mesh, which is why you should always have good topology, especially when you are character modeling. So whenever you start making a new model, you should ask yourself, will this mesh be deformed? And you should also ask yourself if you plan to subdivide this mesh any further or not. Because if your answer to both of the questions is no, and you're making game-ready assets, then you can go ahead and break the n-gon rule by leaving flat surfaces as n-gons. This way you're reducing poly count without causing any shading issues, but curved surfaces still cannot have n-gons. Now moving on to the most boring part of 3D modeling, UV unwrapping. Now most people like to use the concept of peeling an orange and laying out the orange skin flat on a table as a way of visualizing UV unwrapping, but I personally like the idea of peeling a banana and putting its skin flat on a table because that looks cooler. But generally the idea of UV unwrapping is that you're telling the 3D modeling software how you want to texture your model, which part of the textures should be applied to which parts of the model. It might be a little hard to get at first, but the more you UV unwrap, the easier it'll be for you to visualize it. When UV unwrapping, you need to have a clear idea of where you want to mark your seams. Seams are basically where you want to cut the banana peel. Well, I guess that doesn't really work. You don't really cut a banana, do you? Well, seams are basically identifying where you want to cut your orange skin. So generally, you would put seams on sharper edges because that's where a lot of textures and patterns change anyways. But for cylinders, you typically have to choose an edge to add a seam, ideally one that's not exposed to viewers. This is generally a good rule though. You should try your best to hide your seams so that your textures look seamless. Spheres are more of a pain in the ass though. You should visualize unwrapping a globe and creating a map out of that. That's probably the easiest way to visualize it. Otherwise, like, I don't fucking know. It took me like friggin' years to learn how to unwrap a sphere, and I still don't really know how to unwrap a sphere. Now moving on to texturing. This is when you apply colors and shading to a model to make it look like an actual object. The most common term that you'll definitely hear of when it comes to texturing is PBR materials. What the fuck does PBR stand for? Okay, so apparently it stands for physics-based rendering material. Okay. So PBR materials generally have the same parameters. You have the base map, which is basically the color of the mesh. You have the roughness map, which basically determines the different roughness on different parts of the mesh. The white regions have a max value, so they're the roughest, and the black regions have the lowest value, so they're the smoothest. The same applies to the metallic map. The white regions have the highest value, so they're the most metallic, while the black regions have the lowest value, so they're the least metallic. An alpha map basically tells your software which parts of the mesh to render. So the widest regions are the most opaque, while the darkest regions are basically transparent. And then you have your normal map and displacement map. A lot of beginners don't know the difference between the both of these because they do very similar things, but the biggest difference is that displacement maps push around vertices and edges to change the shape of an object, while normal maps do not manipulate the general shape of the mesh, so you don't need to increase your poly count to use normal map. A normal map basically tells the software which direction light reflects off a surface, and you can do a bunch of cool texturing tricks with normal maps. Normal maps are usually used to fake the lighting of bumps and dents, while height maps are usually used for larger details. Normal maps are generally blue in color, but they consist of 3 different colors. The red channel indicates how the model should look when lit from the right, the green channel indicates how the model should look when lit from above or below, and the blue channel indicates how the model should look when it is lit from the front. Now moving on to subsurface scattering, this is mostly used in leaves, and sometimes you can even see it in human skin. It's basically a rendering technique that simulates how light penetrates and scatters within translucent materials. And now finally moving on to ambient occlusion. Ambient occlusion is basically a shading technique that simulates the darkening of areas where surfaces are close together. It basically makes your lighting look super good. Now when it comes to picking software to make your 3D models, it's kind of similar to picking out a kid at a store. I don't fucking know what I just said. It's 3 in the morning. I am tired as fuck. But there are a lot of 3D modeling software that you can pick from, and the most popular choices are Blender, Maya, 3ds Max, Houdini, and Cinema 4D. A lot of them are extremely expensive, so if you're a broke bitch like me, you should go for Blender because that's completely free. When it comes to texturing your model, Substance Painter is kind of the software to go. It can be a little pricey, but at the end of the day, it's kind of worth it given how much you could do in it. And if you're looking to dabble in some texture making, you could also try out Substance Designer. And when you want to compose or render a scene, you could go for Unreal Engine, Marmoset Toolbag, or even Blender. Again, Marmoset Toolbag can be a little expensive, so if you're a broke bitch like me, you can go for Unreal Engine or Blender. If you're looking to create a realistic scene, Unreal Engine is God's gift from heaven. Its lighting and shading system is basically the best in the industry right now, and it's totally free, so you should definitely try it out. And moving on to random software that I found extremely useful in my 3D modeling journey, you have PureRef, which is basically a reference board where you can drag images from online, and I find myself frequently referring to it whenever I make my 3D models. Beatree is also a pricey but industry standard software if you want to make trees or vegetation fast and if you want to make them look good. Marvelous Designer is a cloth sim software. I have personally never used this before, but this is also industry standard if you want to have cloth sims. Again, it can be a little pricey, so I recommend you try doing cloth sims in Blender instead. And of course, who can forget Photoshop? This is if you want to do any final touch-ups or post-processing to your images. Again, there are a lot of free alternatives you can look up online. If you really want to edit your images, I recommend you just look up websites like Photopea. And here are some additional tips that I found extremely useful throughout my journey that you should definitely apply to your own scenes. The first one and most important one is to use a scale man. A scale man is basically just a reference for you to make sure that the scale is consistent throughout your scene. So a lot of you are probably thinking, I don't need a scale man. I have a good idea of what scale is. No, bitch, you are wrong, bitch. This is extremely underrated, especially for beginners, because you motherfuckers think that you have a good idea of what scale is. But guess what? We all don't have a good idea of what fucking scale is. So use a scale man in your scene. The second tip is to use lots of real-world references. Now, you might be saying, oh, I have a good idea of what the real world looks like. Oh, I know what this apple looks like. Wrong again, motherfucker. So make sure you gather lots and lots of references whenever you want to make a scene or whenever you want to make a 3D model. And these are just some additional general things that you should check if you're running into issues when you export your 3D model. Check for non-uniform scale. In Blender, if you have non-uniform scale, this could cause lots and lots of issues. I've talked about this in my other video, so you should probably watch that. But if you want to make sure that you have uniform scale, just select your object, hit Ctrl A and apply if you're using Blender. And if you're using Maya, you just want to make sure that you freeze and delete the history of your mesh before you export it. Also remember to check for overlapping vertices. More often than not, we tend to accidentally create extra vertices that may overlap, that may cause issues with baking or UV unwrapping. In Blender, you can just select all of your vertices and you can just merge by distance by hitting M and clicking on merge by distance. This essentially merges all of the vertices that are very close by. And the last thing that you should check for is backface culling. So backface culling is basically a rendering technique where it discards polygons facing away from the viewer. So essentially all of your faces in your model are facing outwards and the inside of your model is essentially not rendered. But in your 3D modeling software like Blender or Maya, they usually have backface culling off by default, so you can't really tell which direction your faces are facing. So sometimes when you drag your mesh into a different software that has backface culling on, you might notice a couple of faces disappearing in the scene. So you just want to make sure that you have backface culling turned on in your 3D modeling software as well, and you want to make sure that all of your faces are facing outwards and not inwards. But yeah, that basically covers all of the basics that you need to know when it comes to 3D modeling. Now, of course, there's still a lot of techniques that I haven't covered, like baking, how to create game-ready vegetation, and a bunch of other mumbo-jumbo bullshit. 3D modeling is an extremely complicated process, so there's no way that I could fit everything into a single video. But hey, I'm trying my best here. So yeah, that's basically it. Okay, thanks. Bye!